We shared them as best we could. You don't like us? No. No, they exclaimed in unison. Then we will remove these offensive rags. And they took them away. Kratos was willing to acknowledge that his eyesight had improved. I'm beginning to understand why the captain kept you locked up. You are identical down to the last mole, down to the last freckle. Not so much, said the one on the left. Laura's mole is on the inside of her left thigh. See it? I saw it. Zora and I are totally different, said the other. Do you do everything together? The twins exchanged a look and took a step forward with the same idea in mind. His answer became clear when they took off his clothes and carried him to a wide, soft bed. The only thing Kratos had to regret was having knocked over a bottle of wine in the whirlwind of his passion twice. He woke up with a woman on his left and another on his right. He no longer remembered which one was Laura and which one was Zora, but it didn't occur to him to check the features that differentiated them. That would only have gotten them to demand that he make love to them again, and Kratos had a crew on deck to give orders to. He had to fulfill Athena's demand, and soon, judging by the vision of his raised city. I want more wine, she said, reaching over one of the redheads to grab the bottle. We are your slaves, Captain Kratos, said one. As long as you keep us satisfied, added the other. The captain had concubines in his cabin, Kratos commented. Oh, yes, he had other girls, one of the twins admitted, a little sadly. It was never our turn. Never? He wasn't man enough, added the other with a sigh. When 2 or 3 crew members died, he locked us in here. Did they die? Kratos couldn't understand it. And that's why the captain locked you up? What were they doing when they died? They were with us, one answered happily. The other nodded her head, and added, he wanted to keep his crew safe. Of us. We have been very alone. I understand, Kratos said slowly. And we are very glad to have met you. And that you have not died. Really? Same here, Kratos answered as he thought that his trip to Athens might be more interesting than he had imagined. The twin on his left caressed his muscular shoulder and asked, Are you King, Master Kratos? The twin finished on her right. I'm just a soldier, he replied. A great soldier, said one. A champion, the other acknowledged. The gods have assigned me a mission. That seems dangerous, the twins said. We sail towards Athens. There I will free you. We don't want to be free. We want to be your slaves. Eternally, added the other. Or at least until you die. You are very strong, master. And very big. Kratos didn't know what to say. We have never wanted to go to Attica. It's a cold and horrible place, or so they have told us. Kratos cursed the gods wholeheartedly. If only he could be like other men and abandon himself completely to the pleasures of the flesh. But not even Laura and Zora could free him from the nightmares and keep his madness at bay. Now he lived exclusively for Athena's promise to free him from his visions and put an end to the horrible memories that tormented him at all hours. Banishing the visions of death and horror, guilt and vile pain, was a reward far greater than anything Laura and Zora could offer him, no matter how skilled they were. This ship must leave the marine graveyard, he said, putting his legs on the ground. The spilled wine had become as sticky as blood. He started to clean it, but the twins nimbly jumped out of bed. Allow us to do it, Master Kratos. They cleaned his feet lovingly, but he didn't have time for those things. Ares' Hydra was dead, but what other abominations would the god of war send to destroy him? Kratos didn't want to find out, much less trapped between the hulls of so many broken and abandoned ships. You can go up on deck, Kratos told the twins, but you must be fully dressed. We have nothing to wear in this cabin, they answered in unison. Then look for something, he responded in a sharp tone. He hesitated whether to tell them to search the captain's cabin. The other 3 women must have had plenty of clothes, but I suspected that the twins would not welcome taking them from the corpses. We'll go up right away, they answered. Kratos headed to the deck. He was far from Athens, and as soon as he arrived he had to kill a god. Freeing that slave ship from among the other hulls was already going to be a titanic task. On deck, the fresh wind and the possibility of rain suggested that a storm was approaching. Trapped between the other ships, the storm would toss them around and the hull would crack like a nutshell. He went down to the slave hold and looked at those unfortunate people. They were going to whine and beg until I opened the hatches and let them swim away. Maybe freedom reminded them what it was to be a man. "I will free you. But you will work," he said. "You will work harder than you have ever worked." We set sail towards Athens. !Liberanos. I don't need slaves. I need a crew. Have any of you ever worked with rigging? He saw someone timidly raise a hand. You will be my second in command. The rest of you will listen to him and learn from him. Your word is as good as mine. If you disobey either of us, I will throw your guts to the sharks. If you obey, you will be free as soon as we dock in Piraeus. He heard the caged slaves muttering, but the one he had named second in command accepted the challenge and spoke on behalf of the others. Will we be free? I swear on my life that you will be free, Kratos promised. Then let us go. The way the boat is rocking, a storm is approaching. What's your name, second in command? CEO. Have them come up on deck and take their places, CEO. You're right about the storm. With blows and kicks to the side, Kratos forced out the slaves who were reluctant to leave the cage. When the last one had gone on deck, the wind blew strongly and a few small drops of rain hit them. To their rigging. We must raise the sails. There is no other way out of the stemmed water graveyard, Kratos bellowed. Either we get ahead of the storm or we are lost. He saw that COO had mastered the rudiments of setting the sails and tying them securely, but trying to teach it to all the crew members in the rigging was impossible in that wind. One of them screamed and fell off the foremast. Kratos watched as he disappeared beneath the waves. It did not emerge again. Kratos noticed that the ship was jerking, just as a horse reluctant to run could result in no start. CEO did what he could. Kratos had to find a helmsman to man the helm, which moved from side to side. He took a slave by the arm and dragged him to the poop and the helm. Grab it. Move it left or right, as I tell you. The slave obeyed and clung to the tree as if his life depended on it. And so it was. As soon as the man hugged the helm and tried to give in and resist, Kratos headed toward the bow. He stopped next to the statue of Athena. She was still dead, inert, immobile and blind. We're on our way, he said quietly, with the wind blowing against him. Then he tried to lift the anchor that was preventing them from moving. As he slowly raised the anchor, his back began to ache from the strain, and the veins in his arms bulged like ropes. As soon as the huge iron hook left the sea, the ship rose and floated free. To port! To port! The roar with his order was swallowed by the wind, but the novice helmsman saw him gesturing and leaned on the helm. Finding more resistance than he expected, the helmsman redoubled his efforts. Again and again. Kratos let out a scream as the ship veered, its sails billowing in the strong wind. The frames creaked and the keel reverberated as if it had struck some underwater wreckage. A massive wave rose over Kratos and broke over his head. It knocked him off balance and dragged him across the deck until a hand grabbed him tightly. Looking up, he saw CEO smiling. "Careful, Captain," said the second mate, and then he shouted to those in the rigging to make the sails even tighter. Kratos stood up and thanked Athena for sending an expert sailor to help him. A strong gust of wind seemed to lift the boat out of the water, pushed it and made it advance, barely skimming the surface of the sea at lightning speed. The boat advanced in leaps, barely descending into the troughs of the waves. "Be careful with the candles," Kratos shouted. His words were swallowed by the wind. The corners of the sails began to tear as the wind whipped them. "Tie them up. We need more men in the rigging," CEO shouted almost in his ear. "If we do not gather and fold the sails, we are lost. The wind is too strong." "Leave the candles as they are," Kratos responded, also shouting. The ship hit one piece of debris after another in the marine cemetery. The mast will break. The storm will send us to the bottom. Advance under full sail. Kratos ordered. CEO started to complain, but Kratos interrupted him. The helmsman held on bravely to the helm, but it lurched too much for one man to control. Kratos pushed COO and ran to help the helmsman. As he crossed the quarterdeck, he grabbed the slave and dragged him away. "No, let me. We are going to die. We will not survive the storm. Poseidon wants us all to perish in his aquatic graveyard. Help the helmsman control the rudder. We are going to die." The slave fell to his knees. "By all the gods, save us. I beg you, gods of Olympus, save us. Lend a hand or get out of the way." Kratos pushed the man away. The slave's arms were raised above his head, the gusty wind carried his body and, like a seagull, he took flight. Kratos didn't even notice him. That man had had his chance. "Are you going to throw me overboard, Captain? Do you think I don't have the strength left to control the helm?" The helmsman faltered under the pressure of maintaining a steady course in that violent gale. Only a few failed. The rudder gave a jerk, as if it were alive, and lifted the helmsman, who clung to it with all his strength. Kratos joined in the task. The two men straightened the helm. The frames creaked, and for a moment Kratos thought the ship was going to break into pieces. As Zeus began to send his lightning bolts across the sky, Kratos saw transparent lights of many colors crackling off the spars and running up and down the mast and across the sail, and he knew he had received a reprieve. Athena protected him and the ship from the worst of this storm. The small globes of fire that did not burn were the message that the goddess sent him. After a time that seemed eternal, the ship passed by the last of the halls of the marine cemetery and emerged into the open sea. The wind remained constant, but the rain disappeared. His arms and back aching as if they were broken, Kratos dropped to the deck. "The sun, Captain Kratos. The sun shines. Praise Apollo," Kratos said. "Praise Athena." He thought that at least 3 of the gods of Olympus were working in his favor. Poseidon had thanked him and granted him special powers, aside from not claiming the ship and its crew for his aquatic kingdom. For the first time since he boarded that ship, Kratos knew that he would set foot on solid ground again. The next time he did it, it would be in the service of the goddess Athena. "Stay the course," Kratos ordered. "I will stay the course even if I have to tie myself to the helm, Captain," the helmsman stated. "I look forward to returning to the field. As soon as we dock, I'll go where the grass grows tall." Kratos left the man there and went back down to Laura and Zora's cabin. He entered and closed the door behind him. "Master," they shouted in unison. Kratos was exhausted, but he gaped at them. "You have disobeyed me," he said. "You have not looked for suitable clothes." Both were dressed exclusively in tunics. "Then we need a corrective, Master," they replied. "Punish us, please." Although he did not get much rest in the bed he shared with the twins, the trip to the port of Z was pleasant. His tender care helped keep his nightmares at bay. But one day before the great city appeared on the horizon, a huge column of black smoke warned him of the danger that awaited him. Athens was in flames. Kratos stood on the watchtower overlooking the walls above Piraeus. From there he could see the long walls that linked the port to the city of Athens, more than 4,000 cubits inland. Although, as a Spartan, he considered the Athenians to be weak, cowardly and generally despicable, that he, although grudgingly, felt respect for them. With only citizens to defend them, those twin walls were almost intact. It would have been an impressive achievement even if they had only faced a conventional army. Against the hordes of Ares, composed of harpies, undead legionaries, cyclops and who knows what other monstrosities recruited from the dregs of Hades, the Athenians' ability to defend the walls was astonishing, something Kratos would not have believed if there had not been seen with his own eyes. "It is said that the god of war, Ares himself, participates in the battle against us," said the captain of the tower guard, exhausted and sunken-eyed. "Is it true, Ghost of Sparta?" Kratos didn't know. The last thing he needed was to give those pitiful part-time soldiers an excuse to run away. He was thinking about something else, something he wouldn't have believed if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. He turned towards the sea, hoping to see the sails of his old ship disappearing into the horizon for the last time. CEO and many of the others had proven their worth to him. Even if he had had them at his side, it would not have changed the outcome of the battle, but the new captain and his crew would have had the opportunity to die nobly in combat. By sailing away, they only postponed the moment of their death. Unless he stopped Ares before the walls of Athens. As Kratos abandoned the ship in the hours before dawn, the statue of Athena on the bow spoke to him again to remind him that Ares' death would earn him forgiveness for all his crimes. As if he needed to be reminded. Athena also told him about the priestess of her oracle in Athens. She would tell him how to defeat the god of war. He returned his focus to the battle for Athens. The legions of Ares were mainly arrayed against the city, but not uniformly. For some reason that Kratos could not understand, the creatures seemed to avoid the forests and grottos that dotted the countryside around the city. Kratos shook his head, perplexed. It would have made more sense to set those forests on fire, but the god of war was not known for his strategic vision. Unlike Athena, who was legendary for the subtlety of her battle plans, Ares preferred to simply advance his armies in great waves, like a tide of death, until they broke through his enemies' defenses and massacred all living things that they found in their path. Kratos knew it very well. For many years it had been he who had commanded armies like enormous battering rams of human flesh. For years he had laughed like a blood-drunk monster as his men laid waste to entire regions. And he would still continue doing it if it weren't for that village, that humble temple to Athena, and those who had taken refuge there. Kratos shook his head to dismiss the memories. The madness that lurked constantly in the depths of his being threatened to swallow him like quicksand and drown him in an unrelenting nightmare. His assessment of the tactical situation lacked sentimentality. Only a trail of cards continued up the wide road between the long walls. From what he had seen in Piraeus, almost all the draft animals had already been killed for their meat. No ship with provisions entered the port. On the other side of the breakwater, smoke rose from dozens of charred ships. This constituted a most persuasive warning against those who dared to enter those waters. Judging by the curtain of smoke rising from the city, Kratos assumed that the creatures of Ares had found a way to send Greek fire over the walls, or perhaps it was just the Harpies, who carried smoking pots and left them behind. Fall from above to the other side of the walls. As soon as Ares' legions breached the long walls, they would lose any hope of receiving reinforcements or supplies. And, even worse, those legions would have a paved path on which to advance against the weakest point of the defenses. From the city, high in the hills, that army would advance rapidly and destroy everything in its path. Athens would fall without any doubt. To Kratos' trained eye, the city might not last until the next morning. Athena has not abandoned us. The captain spoke as if he were trying to convince himself. The great-eyed goddess will defeat these armies. He will never allow his city to fall. Hold on to whatever courage you have, Kratos said darkly. Athena has heard your prayer. As the captain's voice sounded broken, seized by sudden hope. What helps? When will your help arrive? Today. This Spartan is the ally that Athena sends you, Kratos announced, and jumped from the tower window to land on his feet on the lower wall. With another jump he reached the road. He advanced with long strides, like those he had taken on the battlefield so many times to order his soldiers to take their positions. The long walls cast a cool shadow on the road. From above, the archers fired one rain of arrows after another. Kratos didn't need to see his targets. He heard them. Growling, snorting, animal noises, screeches and roars that could not come from a human throat. Kratos continued running. He saw no reason to waste time defending those walls when it would have been obvious to anyone that they would not hold out another day. An Athenian archer fell from the wall and crashed onto the road a few meters in front of Kratos. The man, pierced by a huge spear and his face ripped off by the harpy's claws, was still holding his bow when he hit the ground violently, protecting his weapon with his last strength. Kratos thought it was good. The man was almost as disciplined as a Spartan. Well, like a very young Spartan, someone who was not yet fully trained. However, Kratos went to him, knelt down and listened to the Athenian's last words, spoken between gasps, "Take my bow and defend the city." It was the only thing the archer said before his soul left him to meet Charon on the bank of the Styx. Kratos took the bow from the corpse's hands and unhooked the quiver, which still contained a dozen arrows. Although he preferred the swords of chaos or his own fists, Kratos was an expert in all types of weapons. He tightened the bowstring and released it without firing any arrows. The archer had been a strong man, and this weapon could be useful to him. As if obeying their thoughts, the citizens driving the cars screamed in panic. Panic turned to agony as an entire section of the wall buckled inward and stones and archers fell. In a matter of seconds, more than 3 meters of wall collapsed. Without stopping to think, Kratos put an arrow on the bow and fired it. The bolt flew towards the undead legionnaire who was sneaking through the gap in the defenses. The arrow nailed the legionary's head to the part of the wall that was still standing. 2 more legionaries, dressed in bronze armor, also entered and suffered the same fate as the first. The arrows did not kill the monsters, but by pinning them to the wall like a rabbit on a spit, the Athenians were able to dismember them. "Run away!" he bellowed at the screaming citizens. "You're getting in my way." Without hesitation, Kratos stepped through the gap, firing as he went. He fired 6 more arrows, skewering several legionnaires against each other, but the undead marching behind them tore them apart with their claws and continued advancing. With 3 more arrows he dispatched 5 or 6. Seeing 2 others approaching brandishing their swords, he reached for another arrow, but the quiver was already empty. He got rid of the bow. Without arrows he was as useless as a eunuch. The 2 decaying monstrosities that lunged at him did not deserve the honor of being destroyed with the blades of chaos. Kratos advanced to meet them and pierced their rotting chests with his fists. He grabbed them by the columns and shook them like someone removing dirt from their hands. Their spines were exposed. As the 2 legionaries collapsed, Kratos cracked his spinal columns as if they were whips and with them dispatched several of his companions. The archers on either side of the gap joined him and fired bolt after bolt at the monsters. The chains on Kratos' forearms grew hotter as the creatures pounced on him. He took out the swords of chaos and brandished them in front to protect himself from the spears. The chains burned his bones. The swords cut through undead flesh and covered the rubble of the wall with dismembered monsters. Their twin swords described circles of fire around them, driving Ares' creatures back through the gap. Though the undead legionaries retreated only to let the Cyclops pass. The one-eyed monster advanced spectacularly. He weighed 3 times more than Kratos and was 10 times taller than him. The creature wielded an iron-studded club so large that, even if it had narrowly missed its blow, the wind generated by the swing of the weapon would have knocked a normal man to the ground. The Cyclops ran towards him, eager to kill or be killed, brandishing the enormous club as if it were a willow branch. He raised it above his head, holding it with both hands, and brought it down on Kratos' head, as if he wanted to pin the Spartan to the ground like a post. Kratos intercepted the blow with the blades of chaos crossed above him. The impact brought him to his knees, but only for a second. He then stood up again and made several cuts around the handle of the weapon with his swords like pruning shears. The end of the club shot out like a stone from a slingshot. The Cyclops roared in pure disbelief. Kratos gained momentum from the stones that had fallen from the wall and launched himself against the monster. He ducked to avoid the Cyclops' clumsy grab and stabbed both swords into his belly. The monster screamed like a man possessed. Kratos twisted the swords inside the wounds. When he finally extracted them, they had viscera attached. The Cyclops tried to catch him again, but Kratos ducked and lunged forward to roll between the monster's legs. Now standing behind the Cyclops, he turned around and looked at his broad, hairy back. He jumped and grabbed the leather straps of the giant's harness while digging his toes into the creature's flesh for a better grip. The beast screeched and flailed, trying to pry Kratos off his vulnerable blade. The ghost of Sparta continued climbing even when the Cyclops began to spin. Kratos reached for the monster's neck, grabbed a lock of greasy hair, and stretched out his other arm to repeatedly strike the Cyclops' face with the hilt of a sword. When it hit his only eye, the Cyclops went crazy. Kratos managed to grab his nose and find his eye swollen and sore. He tore it off, and a viscous liquid dripped between his fingers. The Cyclops was beside himself when he lost his eye. He raised his arms and, enraged, roared at the gods. It was the only chance Kratos was going to have to kill him cleanly. As the Cyclops reared its head back, Kratos attacked. With his feet on the creature's shoulders, he raised the blades of chaos above his head and stabbed the twin blades directly into the open eye socket. Little by little, the Cyclops' violent movements weakened until he bent his knees and blood gushed out from where his eye used to be. The Cyclops fell face first onto the ground. Kratos jumped off the broad back and wiped his swords when he was sure the monster was dead. Above him, on the wall, the Athenian soldiers stood motionless, looking at him in astonishment. Then, a soldier cheered him loudly and everyone on top of the long walls joined in. Death to monsters! An entire company of undeadly legionaries swarmed to finish off Kratos, with a feathered hail of deadly bolts to bore them to pieces. Another cheer went around the wall. Kratos had begun to move towards the gap when he saw what was now heading towards him: wraiths, emaciated monsters with bony arms that ended in deadly sharp swords. From the waist down, their bodies were a spiral of black smoke. They floated toward him with deceptive ease and prepared to attack him. Kratos barely had time to draw the blades of chaos to defend himself. The wraiths coordinated their attack perfectly. They surrounded him and attacked first from the left and then from the right. The arrows that rained down could not make those creatures retreat. The arrows passed through them without harming them, as if their bodies were made of smoke and nothing more. With a blinding swing of his Hades-forged swords, Kratos severed a weapon hand, but the other wraiths closed the circle around him. He defended himself skillfully as he backed into the gap. The best way to deal with those creatures was one by one. By the gods, we will stop them. A few swordsmen ran to help Kratos, clashing their weapons with bronze shields. Their courage far surpassed their skill, but they could relax the pressure of the Whites' attack. Close the gap! Kratos shouted as he engaged in combat with one armed hand, before deftly separating it from his skeletal wrist. You cannot defend this gap for long. The wraiths were already striking the edges of the wall with their weapons to widen the hole. If it became much larger, the Athenians would not be able to defend it, and Kratos did not want to have to watch their rear as he raced toward the city. "I don't know you," said a young soldier who appeared behind him. "Why aren't you wearing armor? Call the engineers, fool!" Kratos bellowed. "If the monsters take this breach, the belly of Athens will be unprotected." The young warrior began shouting orders, and the other Athenians seemed relieved to have someone telling them what to do. The closest soldiers pushed their way into the gap and formed a wall with their shields and their own bodies to repel the hordes of Hades. Others carried heavy boards, rubble, and anything that could be used as a barricade to pile into the hole, but Kratos saw that this was useless. The pressure against a handful of men was too great and no permanent repair could be carried out with the wraiths and legionaries constantly making cuts to widen the gap. The last of the Athenians who were in the breach was shot by undead archers. Half a dozen slipped through the gap and shot fiery arrows in all directions. Each one that reached its target exploded into flames and claimed the life of an Athenian. Kratos threw the blades of chaos once more, finishing off two of the skeletal creatures before they could wreak more havoc on the walkways. The rest of the undead archers concentrated their fire on the newly arrived soldiers who were rushing to plug the gap with devastating effect. By the time Kratos killed the archers who had managed to get through, the wraiths on the other side had widened the hole enough for another Cyclops to slip through. Kratos launched himself to meet the monster. Using his supernatural strength, He lifted the Cyclops and pushed him across the gap, against the wraiths and undead legionnaires on the other side. The Cyclops made his way through his people brandishing his immense club, destroying the living dead and throwing ghosts into the air. Immediately afterwards, he strode to confront Kratos. New legionaries arrived to continue making cuts in the wall and widening the gap with each blow. Kratos calculated the distance and threw both swords. He cut the Cyclops' neck on both sides and pulled hard to hook the curved part of the blades into the back of the creature's neck. As the swords were released, the Cyclops' head fell from his shoulders, bounced off the ground, and rolled to Kratos' feet. A fountain of blood gushed upward from the monster's neck. Kratos raised his face to welcome the red brain as if it were a fresh spring shower. He tore out the Cyclops' eye, held it up and waved it defiantly at Ares' minions, who continued their advance. Further, he shouted to the horde on the other side. "Come on! Come and die!" With a strong kick he knocked down the mass of the dead monster and created a barricade in the gap over which the attackers had to jump. The archers on the wall claimed many victims when their feathered arrows skewered the legionaries against the fallen Cyclops and each other, before they had applauded his victory. Now there was no time. A pair of new Cyclops arrived at the gap and began clearing undead legionaries from the growing pile to clear the way for other monsters, while the wraiths hovered overhead, slashing the nearest archers with their hideous swords, turning them bloody pieces of meat. Kratos again judged the possibilities discouragingly. He didn't know how Athena expected him to save her city, but he was reasonably sure that the goddess didn't want him to give his life for a small breach that was almost 2 kilometers from the city proper. He put away the swords of chaos and looked at his hands. Power surged through him as he released his anger, and Kratos felt like he was once again becoming the conductor of divine power. Poseidon's wrath was still with him. Making his way through the combatants, he climbed atop the dead Cyclops and watched the thousands of Ares' assassins prepare to pass through the ever-widening hole in the wall. Kratos stretched out his arms with his palms facing them, as if he wanted to push them. He staggered as he felt the energy within him grow. With his elbows together, he raised his hands, closed his eyes and focused on what he wanted most. Annihilating energy exploded around him and dug a 50-foot furrow in front of him, deeper than a moat. Kratos extended his hands outwards and the groove turned into a crater. He directed Poseidon's wrath down, out, and down again before falling to his knees, exhausted from the effort. The Cyclops' corpse had disappeared, so charred that not even smoke was coming out of it. The same could be said of the other Cyclops, of all the nearby ghosts, of several hundred undead legionaries, of several meters of wall, and of a few Athenian archers. Between him and what remained of Ares' army was a moat 30 meters deep and practically the same width. To reach the breach, the horde had to make a long descent and a dangerous ascent up a steep and slippery ash slope, completely unprotected by the archers on the wall. The monsters were undeterred and began to slide along the far edge of the pit. Even if they had to fill the entire crater with their own bodies, thousands and thousands of those evil creatures would cross the wall. Nothing would stop them. Kratos drew the blades of chaos and stared at the gap gravely. This was going to be a long fight. The undead legionaries advanced along a hunting trail in the calm forest, weapons clashing at their sides with every step. Some carried scythes and others brandished spiked clubs as they advanced to serve as reinforcements to the rear of the horde attacking the breach in the long walls. Their leader stopped and raised a bony arm to order his patrol to stop. There was a rustling in the bushes. The undead turned toward the noise and drew their weapons, but from behind them leapt a huge grey wolf, snarling as it felled a legionnaire. Strong jaws closed around his bony neck, crushing him and tearing off his head. As the wolf prepared to do the same to the next, its savage growls called to the rest of the pack, which was ambushed in the forest. The creatures of Hades tried to defend themselves, but those wolves fought with a cunning and ferocity that would have amazed any hunter. Some of the cadaverous beings could barely move as their legs were bitten off. Others threw knives, axes, and even swords at the wolves, But the graceful gray assassins dodged them and closed their jaws again around the bony claws of the unarmed undead, who were soon dismembered. Tranquility returned to the forest when the pack of wolves disappeared to prowl their territory in search of new victims. Immediately afterwards, two goddesses materialized at the scene of the slaughter. "Your creatures fight well," Athena said. Artemis narrowed her eyes and looked up, calculating the flight of the eagles and the slow circle formed by the vultures. "The birds tell me of new incursions," he said. "Our brother does not take any notice." "Then let us give him another lesson without delay," Athena replied. "Although all the wolves in the world wouldn't be enough to destroy his army, we can at least keep him away from your forests." The huntress glared at her. "Can?" he repeated. Before Athena could respond, Artemis disappeared. Athena sighed and, with a quick gesture, followed her to a huge clearing filled with Ares' soldiers. The monsters were milling around, completely disorganized. The creatures in charge of officers bellowed and screamed, trying to organize them into something resembling a battle formation. As they began to cross the clearing, Artemis pointed to the edge of the forest, less than 50 feet from where they were. Now, a huge elk emerged from the bushes, lowered its antlers, and charged at the ranks of corpse archers. His horns skewered forward, and as he shook his head, fragments of the living dead flew. The elk bellowed and charged again, but the remaining archers had already readied their arrows. A dozen bows vibrated in unison, and flaming arrows stabbed into the chest of the mighty animal, which staggered, fell to its knees, and died. Before it reached the ground, several packs of wolves emerged from where they were crouching and attacked the formation of archers while they tried to place new arrows on their bows. Its fangs tore at the decaying flesh and its jaws crushed the exposed bones. But the terrifying sound of splintering trees announced the arrival of a new threat. Cyclops. "There are too many," Athena said, placing her hand on her sister's arm. "They are dangerous even for Kratos. Your wolves have nothing to do against them. It won't be necessary." About 10 Cyclops approached, destroying entire trees with their powerful clubs. The largest was in the lead, shouting at the wolves, but before he had gone half the distance, he stiffened, his eyes rolled back in his head, and he fell on his face. "Hair and horns are not the most lethal weapons of my subjects," Artemis said with satisfaction. "Vipers can take down even Cyclops." "I see." The other brutes hesitated, unsure of their strategy now that their leader lay dead. The sky echoed with the furious screech of an eagle. The huge golden birds of prey fell from the sky like arrows, pounced on the Cyclops' eyes and tore them apart with their outstretched claws. With a few becks they tore chunks of bloody flesh from the monsters' faces. Then the birds took flight. "Now we will turn them back," said Artemis. He pointed to the point in this forest from where 3 enormous bears were lumbering forward. While the wolves held off the legionaries and other undead, the bears attacked the remaining Cyclops with their blood-covered paws. Ares' army began to dissolve as fear took its toll on the creatures. The packs of wolves, charging deer, bears, eagles and snakes managed to scare away the monsters that were advancing in the direction of the long walls. "Artemis, sister," Athena began, "you have kept your promise. Now my Athenians will be able—" "Shut up." Artemis tensed. With a gesture, the bow came to his hand. With another, he made a golden arrow appear and was placed on the bow. "Hide." Athena frowned. "Hide me from what?" A second later, the heavens opened and Ares walked past them, so big that the flames in his hair could have set the clouds on fire. Athena thought that her sister's instincts were as accurate as her arrows and decided to follow Artemis's advice. With an elegant movement of her hands she surrounded herself with fog. And when it evaporated, she was no longer seen anywhere. Ares didn't even notice. From above, he looked disapprovingly at the mob that his army had become. "But what's wrong with you?" The voice of the god made the earth shake. He reached out and, with one titanic hand, grabbed bears, moose, and wolves. "Animals? Do simple animals make you flee as if you were cattle? I will teach you how to treat animals." He made a fist and began to squeeze. "Don't do it," Artemis said. Ares reacted as if he had been stung, but only momentarily. Then his natural belligerence prevailed. "Who dares to give orders to the god of war?" Artemis emerged from the trees she was hiding among in a human-sized, bow drawn and string against her cheek as she looked along the arrow. "Be very careful, brother. Put my creatures back down very carefully." Ares snorted from a height 12 times his sister's height. "And why should I do it? My pulse isn't as good as it used to be," Artemis said calmly. "I wouldn't want to have to explain to our father that my fingers slipped when I was aiming my arrow at your face. You wouldn't dare. The word of Zeus forbids. Kill." Artemis finished the sentence. "From here, an arrow in the eye would only be a nuisance. I don't think you were one-eyed for more than a decade or two. Would you help that treacherous bitch Athena against me?" "I would defend my kingdom and its creatures," Artemis replied without flinching. "Leave them on the ground and continue on your way. You will not attack me. You can't. Not as long as it only threatens mortals." He clenched his fist until blood ran between his fingers. "I can crush all these forest creatures, and you can't even touch me. You have attacked my creatures." Artemis lowered her bow. "Now you will see how I attack yours." He released the arrow, which shot out of the bow at lightning speed. And before it reached its target, another arrow appeared and also shot out. So many arrows flew, and so quickly, that the clearing seemed to be filled with a golden mist that hummed like a hornet's nest. After a few seconds, Artemis lowered her bow and looked at Ares. "What do you say to me?" The god of war looked at his army. All the creatures in the clearing were dead, all the living dead were so mutilated that it was impossible to recognize them. The wolves, bears and moose were still safe and sound. For a few seconds, the only thing that could be heard was the mocking screech of an eagle in the distance. "Perhaps I was hasty," said Ares. "Maybe. What if my legions and I leave your forests in peace? Then my creatures and I will have no reason to attack yours. Deal?" "Yes," said the hunter of the gods. "Deal done." Athena, lurking invisibly among the trees, shook her head and let out a disappointed sigh. He didn't like his family members signing a truce, even if Ares and Artemis could violate it at the slightest provocation. Even so, Artemis's work had not been a total failure. The skirmish in the forest should have relieved the pressure from the long walls and Kratos could head to the city. Killing monsters was all well and good and reasonably entertaining, but it didn't get him anywhere. Athena took a deep breath and enjoyed the smell of pine and earth. He closed his eyes and went into a slight trance. His divination skills filled his head with fleeting visions of the future. She gasped and opened her eyes, amazed by what she had seen. She felt cold and realized that even if Artemis and Poseidon, the powerful lord of the seas, had joined her to confront the god of war, they would have failed. Ares had become very powerful, and increasingly crazy. With his actions he would have turned even the columns of Olympus into ruins. And she couldn't do anything, because Zeus would never revoke the order that forbade one god to kill another. She realized that as long as she and the rest of Olympus, including Heavenly Father, were tied, Ares would not obey. Ambition and madness were a deadly mix. If she couldn't kill Ares, Kratos should. But how? How could a mortal kill a god? Kratos had to get to the Oracle Priestess. It was the only way for that question to be answered, because the power of the Oracle was such that it could make Kratos know things that not even the gods knew. Athena hoped that would be enough. It had to be enough. He turned around and, simply willing, returned to Olympus, crossed his chambers and entered the Hall of Eternity. It was necessary for Kratos to receive another gift of power to reach the Oracle Priestess. She took a few steps through the room that took her to an arch from which some perfumed and diaphanous veils hung. He crossed them and entered a marvel of erratic architecture and seductive decoration typical of a Sybarite. Wherever he looked, bronze and silver mirrors reflected images even more flattering than those of his favorite mirror in his chambers. A pool filled with lilac-scented water built next to a low bed gave a different tone to its reflection. "Welcome, Athena," a soft and sensual voice greeted her. as attractive as a lover's caress. My lady Aphrodite. Athena bowed deeply in the direction of the tapestry to her right, which depicted humans and gods copulating in 100 different ways. He assumed that the goddess of love must be hidden there. The sex goddess and the virgin warrior had a tense relationship, complicated by the uncertain nature of their familial bond. Aphrodite was born from the genitals of Uranus when his son Cronus, the father of Zeus, tore them off from the old god and threw them into the Mediterranean. The drops of blood became the Furies to Athena. That made sense, and the organ itself was reborn in the form of an infinitely desirable goddess. Having been born from the foam of the sea, Aphrodite could be considered not part of the family except through marriage, since she was married to Hephaestus, brother of Athena. He could consider the goddess simply his sister-in-law. However, she had also been born as a result of an act by Cronus, which, in a way, made her the sister of Zeus, Poseidon and Hades. That meant he owed her even greater deference. Finally, she had become flesh from the penis of Uranus, Zeus's uncle, and that made her the heavenly father's aunt. Aphrodite herself refused to clarify her complex genealogy. For her part, Athena avoided the goddess of lust whenever she could. Athena's cunning was very different from Aphrodite's. The tapestry of infinite coitus shook and Aphrodite emerged from behind it. When she appeared, she warmed the room with her beauty. Certainly, a more seductive radiance covered all of Olympus. From your tone, Aphrodite said, I sense that it is not a courtesy visit and that you are not here to talk about business either. Athena nodded, I bring bad news. And how come you haven't sent Hermes? Aphrodite reclined languidly on the padded couch. Hermes was here recently and he didn't say anything to me. Perhaps he was distracted by other concerns, replied Athena, who knew perfectly well what Aphrodite and the messenger of the gods had been doing. Hermes regularly visited Aphrodite's chambers, and was known to bring the goddess more than just news. Are you suggesting that the simple pleasure of the flesh could have distracted him from his duty? I'm not suggesting anything, Athena replied innocently. The young couple you have been so pleased to instruct recently. In Mycenae? Why not? Athena thought. He wasn't thinking of anyone in particular, but he knew that Aphrodite went out of his way to pay attention to thousands of such lovers at any given time. Rumor has it that they might have offended Medusa with their amorous activities, he said, thinking, it's a rumor I just made up, but a rumor nonetheless. It is possible that he has sworn to turn not only them, but all your disciples into stone. And perhaps even your Olympian self. Medusa poses no threat, Aphrodite replied with a dismissive gesture. She is nothing more than a malicious old hag. A witch, no, a gorgon, Athena corrected her. Perhaps he intends to destroy all those who indulge in your pleasurable practices. Are you still angry with her? Aphrodite asked slyly. Have you still not forgiven her for your encounter with Poseidon in your temple in Carthage? My uncle's meetings are not a cause for concern. Not of concern, but of surprise. Aphrodite gave Athena a decidedly mischievous smile. Oh, if you knew how many times and in how many places he and I have. We were talking about Medusa, Athena interrupted, and made a gesture with her hand, like a sword that could cut off that topic of conversation. It could pose a terrible danger to your worshippers. Why would you bother? She and her sisters are very limited. With the blind, yes. Otherwise, they would turn their lovers into stone with a carefree look. But his rage grows as the centuries pass. It has reached the point of consuming Medusa and making you the focus of its wrath. I'll talk to her. Can. Wait, Aphrodite. There is still more. He could hurt you, his anger is so intense. You've already lost a lot of followers recently. Athena was making conjectures again. In Athens, she had lost hundreds of worshippers in a single day. War always caused disruption and death. Followers of Aphrodite must also have died, although it was the work of Ares and not Medusa. You can't. Zeus would punish her severely just for trying. If he condemned you eternally to the underworld, you would not be in a position to enjoy his punishment. Aphrodite walked around the room while thinking. Athena barely paid attention to him, absorbed as she was in her own image reproduced to infinity in the countless mirrors. The image of Aphrodite with the lover must have been exciting. Athena had never had a lover, but the mere sight of herself was enough to guess the pleasure that must be received in a room like that. I can't kill Medusa, and neither can you. Zeus forbids such brawls. Athena almost laughed. Aphrodite referred to the offer to kill another god as a simple brawl. That's right, but there's nothing that says a mortal can't kill a gorgon. No one has ever done it. That does not mean that it cannot be obtained with the appropriate instrument of destruction. Aphrodite shook her head and said, "No, that's not right. Being the force that kills Medusa is not right. We can resolve our differences, whatever they may be." Medusa envies your beauty, Athena insisted. "I wish I had a lover, anyone, as skilled as the one you could accept in your bed for just one night." Athena lowered her tone of voice until it became a knowing whisper. "She is convinced that you have stolen Hermes from her." Aphrodite laughed harshly. "Hermes sleeps where he pleases." He smiled a little. "He is always welcome in these chambers, but I can't imagine him sleeping with Medusa, even blindfolded. Hermes is inspired by beauty. Ugliness offends him. Medusa blames you for her natural inclination. How can you demand that he go against his nature?" Aphrodite asked. "That would introduce evil into the world, where there should only be love. That's how jealous and evil she is." Athena saw that Aphrodite had straightened her torso and that determination hardened the goddess's heart. "I cannot tolerate a gorgon endangering Hermes. And I cannot bear to know that Medusa is plotting against you, dear Aphrodite. I'll tell you what we can do." Athena left Aphrodite soon after, certain that Krotos' character would be tempered further and his skills honed to perfection before the final battle against Ares. Provided he was able to reach the Oracle Priestess and find out, how could he kill a god? Krotos climbed to the top of a pile of corpses to see how the wall repair work was progressing. The engineers had placed sturdy beams against the wall and buried posts in the ground to support them. It was not a very refined work, but it would serve to prevent Ares' minions from accessing the road. If he avoided a possible attack from behind by the skeletal archers, he could advance towards the city again. Without saying a word to the defenders closest to him, Krotos jumped onto the road and ran in the direction of the city. Night fell on Athens. The enormous columns of smoke rose in a circle, illuminated only by the same fires that generated them. Above that mist, Krotos sometimes saw Ares himself, as big as a mountain, towering over the Acropolis. From the same hand of the god came the Greek fire, large flaming balls that he launched at his whim throughout the city. The road began to fill with refugees, citizens trying to hold on to what mattered most to them, flee the city while they could, leaving the way clear for the soldiers to fortify and defend it in the best way possible. Every few meters, the crowd was so great that it took a great effort for Krotos to move forward, but the Spartan did not take long to correct this small inconvenience. Each time this happened, Krotos would break through with the help of the blades of chaos. The bloody pieces of the refugees flew above Krotos, and the Athenians watching the carnage did their best not to cross their path. Krotos did not waste a moment on those unfortunates. He was not there to save the citizens. The swords of chaos drank their innocent blood just as the weapons of their enemies would have done. The strength that filled him with each new murder made him run even faster. He seemed to be wearing the winged sandals of Hermes himself. The closer he got to the destroyed city gate, the more noxious the dark smoke seemed. I could never forget the sight of the burning corpses. After so much fighting, it was already impossible for them to dig graves for everyone. There were always more dead people than shovels and men available to use them. Krotos had ordered the bodies to be piled up and set on fire. Hundreds of corpses had fueled the funeral pyre that had not stopped burning for years. The city gates were in pieces. A few citizens were picking their way through the rubble as Ares' fire continued to rain down on them. Their screams were brief and soon became part of the great fire. Only the barracks remained intact, although it seemed abandoned. However, as Kratos passed by, he heard a voice shouting from one of the shadowed windows. "Hey, you! Stop!" The voice was weak, breathless, and when Kratos turned to see who was speaking to him, he found a bent and wrinkled man, with just enough strength to stand up inside his armor. What are you doing here?" "I seek the priestess of the Oracle of Athena, old man." The old guard stared at him with his short-sighted eyes. "The Oracle? So that? Where is?" Kratos asked with all the patience he was capable of. "He has a room in the Parthenon, on the east side of the Acropolis, but..." The old man shook his head, showing his dismay. "That whole area is on fire. The priestess must be dead. No one has seen her since the battle began. He once predicted this future for me, you know. That was a long time ago. I had to make a sacrifice." Kratos managed to contain the desire to cut off the old man's head. "How can I get to the Acropolis?" he mumbled. "You can't cross here." Just before one of those fireballs destroyed the door, the guard commander gave me orders not to let anyone in. The old man held a dagger in his trembling hand. "Besides, why do you want to go there? Everything is infested with undead, cyclops, and what is even worse, I have seen the Minotaur." Kratos made a tired gesture, thinking about the fight on the wall. More useless efforts. Ares' army had already entered the city. He left the man babbling and walked into the dark streets, barely illuminated by the distant fires. As he ran through the darkened city, Kratos cursed himself for having been so stupid as the Blades of Chaos sang their crimson song through the countless bodies of Ares' minions. He tore the undead legionnaires to pieces with such haste that they couldn't even make Kratos slow down. The skeletal archers fired flaming arrows at him, but none hit him. Skillfully, with just a gesture, he evaded furious cyclops and specters that appeared and disappeared in a ghostly way. And all that for nothing. Like the carnage that had taken place at the breach in the wall, all that had been for nothing. Ares' army had not attacked the wall to gain access to the city, but because that was where the soldiers were. The legions of Ares were only interested in killing. If the Athenian soldiers had camped in Piraeus, those disgusting creatures would have attacked there. They did not need to cross any walls. As Kratos ran, more and more enemies sprang from the ground, as if an inconceivable hell had opened its doors and let all its offspring out. Kratos cursed himself for fighting them as if they were human beings. He didn't bother killing them. Why bother? He could not protect Athens and its inhabitants from the attack of Ares' army. It was impossible to destroy God's army. Like the teeth of a dragon, every beast Kratos slew could be reborn anywhere, at any time. Killing them only served to give more strength to the swords, a strength he no longer needed. To hell with the fight. He would seek out the Oracle priestess, find out her secret, and continue on his way. As he should have done from the beginning. He heard snorts and grunts coming from the next corner, mixing with the voices of men screaming like little children. Soon 2 Athenian soldiers appeared, running like mad, leaving weapons and shields behind. They yelled at Kratos to run. "It's right behind," they said. A second later, Kratos discovered that they were fleeing from a huge creature with the body of a man and the head and hooves of a bull. The Minotaur, the Cretan monster that Theseus had supposedly killed. Kratos snorted. Why would he be surprised to discover that the creature was alive? After all, Theseus was an Athenian. The Minotaur brandished an enormous labyrinth, the double-edged Cretan axe, the size of a man and twice as heavy. The enormous beast raised its labyrinth and, with a powerful movement, launched it, spinning it around on itself through the impenetrable darkness. One of the soldiers looked over his shoulder in fear and, seeing the axe approaching, crouched to the side. The other didn't turn it around. The first news he had of the flying axe was when it severed his head with a clean cut and continued on its way at the same speed, whistling through the air, spinning around itself, heading towards Kratos' face. Kratos calculated the distance and speed of the swing and took a step forward so that he was hit by the handle of the flying axe and not the blood-smeared blade. The force of the impact would have killed a normal man. Kratos didn't even blink. "Run away," shouted the soldier who was left alive as he ran past him. "You have to run away. The Spartans are running towards the enemy," Kratos answered with all the disdain in the world. The Minotaur roared, lowered its bare white horns and charged at him. Kratos touched his lips. "You'll want this back," he said, and threw it at the monster, which stopped dead, growled, and attempted to repeat Kratos' feat. The Minotaur was about to discover that it was more difficult than it seemed. He miscalculated by half a step. The edge of the axe passed through his hand, then his snout, then his skull, and continued spinning until he disappeared into the darkness. The half-decapitated corpse began to sway. Kratos lifted the severed head of the Athenian soldier and threw it like a stone. The head slammed into the monster's chest, causing the massive beast to collapse. Kratos looked at the dead soldier with contempt. As he passed the corpse of the Minotaur, he made a disdainful gesture and snorted. "Theseus. What a hero. Only the Athenians would make a man a hero for killing that mean beast." Thank goodness Kratos wasn't there to save all those people. The very sight of it disgusted him. However, before he reached the corner, he realized that he had made a mistake. It was not the Minotaur, but just one of the Minotaurs. 3 more bullmen were approaching him with their axes raised. Kratos took out the swords of chaos without slowing down. Another pointless delay. It would be better to stay away from the main streets. The 3 Minotaurs spread out to block his path, but a run faster than a horse's gallop gave Kratos the boost he needed. About 10 paces from the monsters, Kratos threw one of the swords of chaos upwards, which caught the edge of the nearest balcony. The chain tightened and lifted him above the heads of the astonished Minotaurs. He threw the other sword to a higher balcony and swung like that until he reached the rooftops. From there the Parthenon could be seen perfectly, and behind it rose above the horizon the figure of the god of war, who continued to throw flaming rubble on the city. That small pause was enough for Ares' minions to locate him again. A flock of harpies swooped down on the roof he stood on, wraiths broke through the nearby walls, and the entire building shook as Minotaurs and Cyclops scaled its walls. "Ares!" Kratos shouted defiantly, brandishing the immortal fire of the blades of chaos. The monumental god of war turned to look at him. His eyes looked like bloody full moons. Behind the flames of his beard, Ares' lips curved into a cruel smile as he raised his burning hand toward the sky high enough to set the clouds on fire. He launched an incandescent ball larger than the building Kratos was in. As the flaming projectile approached at enormous speed, Kratos had a second to wonder if his arrogance and pride had not made him rush to attract the attention of the god of war. He made a prodigious leap from where all his enemies surrounded him until he reached the wall of a taller nearby building, jumped again and passed over a somewhat larger square. He fell against a half-collapsed column and clung to it while looking behind him at the roof he had just left. What he saw gave him pause. The entire building became a great mass of fire, the harpies screamed, the Cyclops howled, and the Minotaurs roared as they were consumed by the flames. Then it was he who screamed, as a piece of gelatinous fire ran down his back. He couldn't hold on any tighter and slid down his spine until he fell to the ground, writhing in pain. He rolled over, as if they were simple flames that burned his flesh, but it didn't help him much. The flames cornered him and the square was filled with monsters. With a superhuman effort, gritting his teeth to endure the heat that burned his back, Kratos lunged forward. Towards the Parthenon. Towards the Temple of Athena. The pain did not make the ghost of Sparta slow down. He continued stumbling towards the oracle, towards the secret that would reveal to him how to kill a god. Kratos ran as fast as he could. The pain in my back was decreasing and it killed when it had to. He stumbled through the streets, across the rooftops, and even through the labyrinthine sewers that connected the endless catacombs. Although the black waters burned his back more than he could imagine, he endured without fainting, and by the time he surfaced again, the wound caused by Ares had been healed. His skin was tight, but he could move and fight if necessary. Finally, after a time that seemed eternal, He reached a wide avenue that led from the Acropolis to the Parthenon. A new challenge awaited him. The road was patrolled by centaurs. Wild and untamable, those monsters, half man and half horse, had, and Kratos could attest, a well-deserved reputation for ferocity. He had already faced those creatures on other occasions and knew that they could be fearsome adversaries. But none had lived to tell the tale. None who had faced the ghost of Sparta. The one who was closest spotted him in the smoke. He neighed in a warlike voice, coiled back to face him, and charged without a second thought. Kratos stood where he was and waited. Stamping its hooves on the ground, the centaur galloped in their direction. Kratos realized that he couldn't beat the creature in speed, especially with the skin on its back tearing painfully with every movement it made. He judged the distance well and stepped aside at the last moment. Like any quadruped, once the attack was launched, it was impossible for the centaur to turn laterally. Kratos let the horseman pass him by. However, unlike other quadrupeds, centaurs possessed the ability to rotate their upper body. And that's what he did. The tip of the spear nearly skewered Kratos. A quick movement with the sword prevented a serious wound to his side. The horseman tried to dig his hind hooves into the ground to break and turn around, but the centaurs couldn't correct the direction of the attack so quickly. Kratos took advantage of the situation. He charged while the centaur's entire weight rested on its hind hooves. If the centaur had tried to kick him, Kratos' offensive would have failed. He arched over the horseman's back and made the blades of chaos make two deadly circles. Any of them would have caused the death of the centaur. The right made a deep cut in his neck and the left toward his side and let a torrent of viscera fall onto the floor of the square. Kratos lost his balance, slipped in the centaur's blood and fell heavily on his corpse. For a few minutes he was unable to get up from the puddle. With great effort, he stood up, straightened, and regained some of his usual strength, although his ability to move was still restricted by the skin on his back, as tight as that of a drum. He inspected the area. It was just as feared. A large part of Ares' army had entered the city. Two more centaurs were galloping closer. One of them held a large spear under his muscular arm, the other was spinning a large iron ball attached to the end of a long chain. Kratos dropped to the ground just as they came at him. The ball attached to the chain passed over his head without harming him, but the spear stuck in his forearm. If it weren't for the chain embedded in the flesh and fused to the bone, he would have lost a hand. Despite the injury, the counterattack was immediate. Had he been in perfect condition, had his muscles and powerful back responded as they should, he would not have missed the blow. But he failed, and the centaur was unharmed by the attack of his swords. Kneeling, like a penitent, he deployed the swords of chaos to the sides and cut off the front legs of the two centaurs. The beasts fell on their faces, skidding, and left a trail of blood on the ground. Kratos stood up, and with one more swing of the swords he caused the two heads to separate from their bodies. He shook his swords to clean them of remains of viscera while he looked for new enemies, new victims, but around him he found only bonfires and remains of the carnage. There were fires everywhere, like weeds devouring the city. He set off towards the Parthenon and regained his strength with every step. The swords of chaos, after having ended several lives, nourished him again and allowed him to regenerate. The skin on his back was still tight as a reminder of the stupidity he had committed in trying to provoke a god. At times, Kratos used his swords as walking sticks to support himself on the increasingly steep path. The soldier had told him that Athena's oracle was in a temple near the majestic structure, now blackened by soot and illuminated by the burning city. Kratos heard a louder and louder whistle that was not at all unfamiliar to him. In the blink of an eye, he dove headlong to the other side of a small wall an instant before another ball of divine fire splashed burning liquid all over the area. Fleeing one of the flares, he entered the patio to seek refuge under the tiled eaves. I couldn't bear to go through that anguish once again. He found a fountain overrun by weeds with some water. He jumped inside and rolled in the wet, smelly mud. The stagnant water smelled like dead fish, but it served to drown out what was left of the liquid burning his back. By the gods, he mumbled, gritting his teeth as the last wave of pain washed over him. He stood up, aware that he could resume the fight. For his honor, for Athena, and because it was the only thing he knew how to do. New obstacles awaited him as he returned to the cobblestone street. The flaming balls invaded all the paths that led to the summit and turned them into rivers of fire. Ares closed all access to him, as if he knew where Kratos was going. He cursed his fate and began to run once again. He began to surround the Acropolis. There must have been some gap in the ring of fire drawn by the god of war. His new endeavor led him to a quieter area of Athens that had so far been spared destruction. People watched in fear from the windows, but there were no bodies in the streets, although that was not going to take long to change. A little further from where he was, he ran into a patrol of undead. The monstrous skeletons lurked in the streets, brandishing scythes that seemed capable of cutting the very columns of the Parthenon. Kratos noticed that the creatures were wearing armor blackened by soot but without any obvious signs of burns. Armor that could protect him from Ares' fire was exactly what he needed. He approached behind the well-equipped skeletons and quickened his pace to approach faster and faster. Some unholy instinct must have alerted the skeletons to their rival. They turned, and the long, sinister edges of their deadly scythes yearned to spill Spartan blood. He stopped the nearest one with his left sword. Sparks and flames flew, like throwing green pine wood into a bonfire. He flanked the creature, leaving her and her armor between him and the rest of the patrol. The legionaries gathered around him and launched new attacks. Kratos was too focused on defending himself to fight back, especially since he didn't want to damage their armor, which was the only reason fighting them was worth it. The clash of weapons sent flames flying in all directions. The house behind Kratos began to burn. He didn't pay attention to it. He had seen a flank to attack. He dropped the blades of chaos, lunged forward, and grabbed the hilt of the nearest legionnary's scythe. The fire from the burning house caused new blisters to appear on his battered bare back. He urgently needed that armor. Instead of snatching the weapon from the creature, Kratos leveraged it, shielding himself with the legionnary's body from the other's attacks. The scythes pierced the creature's torso again and again, and just as the weapons were trapped in his comrade's body, Kratos reached behind his back to draw the blades of chaos. After a deadly flourish, the heads of the undead fell like stones thrown from catapults. The bodies continued to swing their sides back and forth in a convulsive manner. By losing their heads, they had also lost their sense of sight, which made them easy prey. Kratos dissected them with rapid efficiency, cutting off arms and legs and leaving only the torsos. Those living dead were not Spartans. It would take at least 3 of his chest pieces to cover Kratos' enormous torso. After kicking away several limbs, he took the coslet that was in the best condition and tied it with a strap around his back, another that had some slits tied it to his chest. The armor did not cover him perfectly, but its purpose was not to protect himself from the monstrous legions of Ares, but from the searing fire that the god of war spewed. With a shrug, the armor settled as best as possible, but before he could look for a path that would lead him to the summit, he saw other undead enter one of the houses. He had adjusted his armor in time, before the attack of 2 more legionaries carrying magical shields. Kratos let out a howl of fury as he launched himself into the attack. The blades of chaos bounced off the first legionnary's shield and Kratos staggered momentarily. Seeing him lose his balance, the 2 legionaries thought they had some chance of defeating him. With their 2 glowing shields raised, they launched an attack. Kratos fought not to perish. Those shields, apart from serving as protection against the swords of chaos, were absorbing his strength. With each blow, he felt his energy waning. The Spartan stepped back until he leaned his back against a stone wall. The 2 legionaries separated so they could attack him from different angles. Screaming in rage, Kratos lunged forward, between the shields. He somersaulted, stood up, and turned around. Now he had the 2 undead with their backs against the wall. The blades he had to fight against were still behind the shields, without the blows of his magical swords being able to do them any harm, apart from robbing him of more and more strength. Kratos released the blades of chaos and let them return to his back on their own as he dropped to the ground. Just as he expected, the nearest undead lowered its glowing magic shield, but not fast enough to catch him. As the shield hit the ground, it caused a dazzling explosion. Kratos made one last effort and grabbed the undead by the ankle. The Legionnaire, with the wall behind him, could not go back. Kratos pressed with all his might, and did not stop until he crushed the undead's leg. He stabbed him with his spear. Kratos ignored the pain the blade caused as it stabbed into his arm. The chains of the swords of chaos protected him from real harm. Kratos growled, lifted the undead into the air, and slammed it to the ground before his companion could come to his aid. A lame blow to the head ended the threat posed by the Legionnaire. Kratos dodged to the side as the other lunged at him. The spear stuck into the stone wall, granting him another chance. Overcoming the debilitating magical shield was impossible, so he grabbed the one his shattered opponent had left on the ground and threw it like a discus at the Legionnaire while he tried to remove the spear from the wall. The magical blade cut the legs of the undead and made it fall to the ground next to its companion. The Spartan's fist repeatedly smashed his head into dust. Kratos kicked away the magical shields. When he was about to resume his journey, screams coming from a building prompted him to look through one of the open doors. A man and a woman hugged each other in terror while an undead Legionnaire brandished thin knives and made them clash, reveling in the fear he caused them. Kratos hit the door frame with the pommel of his sword. The undead glanced over his shoulder and looked back at the man and woman. When he faced the ghost of Sparta, he only managed to see the blades of chaos for an instant before they cut his torso in two. Kratos took a step back and let the pieces fall to the ground. The legs without torso tried to kick him without strength. He didn't pay them the slightest attention. "The gods have blessed us," said the man. "You have saved us. I have not saved you. I have only postponed your death for a moment." Kratos turned to leave. "You should save your energy to escape from here. We were paying tribute to Aphrodite," the woman said as she showed him a small carved wooden box. It was filled with vials of aromatic oils. "You should be on the walls, defending your city. There is always time to make an offering," he said, looking at his companion, who was obviously a craftsman and not a soldier. "Maybe you guys have it," he growled, and walked back out into the street. Before placing his sandals on the stones of the street, Athena vanished before him. The entire world glowed and felt as if it were rising into the sky. And the light became a blinding celestial flash, and from that Olympic splendor appeared a woman whose body was so perfect that the mere sight of it impacted him more than any of the enemies he had faced. Kratos had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. "My lady Aphrodite, I greet you, Spartan. I wish to thank you for rescuing my disciples." "Goddess," Kratos managed to say, and bowed his head. "It is an honor to serve you." He coughed and cleared his throat again. "As you wish, Kratos." Aphrodite pronounced his name with the same softness as a lover caresses. "Zora and Laura have told me about your talents." "Zora and Laura?" Kratos blinked. "The twins? Have they spoken to you?" "Not as often as they should," whispered the goddess of love. "But I guess all parents have the same complaint." "Are you his mother?" That explained so many things about the twins that Kratos was speechless. A slender finger of her thin hand ran over her lips to silence any comments. "Athena asked me to contribute a gift to help you in your task. The only gift I need is to be free to be able to fulfill my task." His laughter was like the ringing of silver bells. "What you need, Spartan, is to be grateful when a god decides to grant you something." He gently caressed her cheek. His fingers became cold with the caress. "You will carry out the task for me too. I'm already committed. You will destroy the Queen of the Gorgons." Kratos frowned. "But why her? Why now?" "You are so adorable," the goddess whispered, "that this time I won't make you eviscerate you for asking me that question. You must kill Medusa and bring me her head. I will grant you the gift of the Gorgons, transforming men into stone." The goddess waved her hand and made the serene Olympus disappear. Kratos tried to say something but couldn't find breath. He tried to see but there was no light. He tried to move and didn't know if the wild chaos around him was really around him or just something inside his head. Or both. He was squatting in a cold, dark place when he heard the soft hiss of snakes. He stood up. The sooner he satisfied Aphrodite's desire to destroy the Gorgon, the sooner he could return to Athens to find the oracle's priestess. The gloom that surrounded him hid the elusive snakes. Blindly, he took a few steps to the side and heard the sound of ankle-deep water. His hand found a slimy stone wall. He pressed his ear against the wall and waited, breathing slowly, trying to hold his breath in order to detect any vibrations. He didn't hear anything. Sigh. What did he expect? That Aphrodite would make Medusa appear right in front of him? As his eyes became accustomed to the darkness, he began to glimpse the space around him. The goddess had transported him to the intersection point of 3 low-ceiling tunnels dug into the rock. There was no light illuminating any of the tunnels. The dim clarity that allowed him to see was due to the soft luminescent moss clinging to the cracks in the rock. He followed the tunnel in front of him, but there was no way out. Kratos forcefully pushed the rock that prevented him from continuing. His anger was growing. More time wasted. The Oracle Priestess was in danger of death or worse if Ares captured her. Kratos didn't care if the fortune teller lived or died, as long as she revealed the secret to him. Kratos recalled a discussion around a campfire with his officers before the battle. Some wicked people had been speculating that the gods need human sacrifices just as a tree needs sunlight. Could a god exist without followers who worshipped him? Kratos thought that if things continued as they were in Athens, perhaps he would soon get an answer to that question. Would Athena's power decline? Would it disappear? Zeus had forbidden one god to kill another, but Ares seemed to have found a way around the prohibition. In the past, Ares had always preferred brute force over subtlety, but perhaps he had learned his lesson by now. The siege of Athens had all the hallmarks of Ares's furious ways, but perhaps this time his strategy was different. By killing Athenians, Athena lost followers. If she killed a large enough number, perhaps her followers would abandon her for other gods. Who better than the god of war, who had defeated his goddess? In that world plagued by uncertainty, displays of strength drew people to the temples of Ares. Kratos, on certain occasions, had been the author of many of these demonstrations, and he himself had become the symbol on Earth of the power of Ares. Kratos' officers thought that a god without followers would fade like mist in the morning sun. If this was the fate that awaited Athena, Kratos' chance at revenge on his former lord would vanish with it. And the nightmares would continue with all their fury, threatening to destroy his sanity. After a few more blows, he was convinced that, despite his prodigious strength, the wall would hold. Kratos turned around and retraced his steps. The water in front of him began to move menacingly before reaching the point where Aphrodite had abandoned him. Kratos had to bend down in order to remove the blades of chaos from his back. Just in time. From the dark waters emerged a snake whose head was larger than one of Kratos' fists. Its jaws glistened. The poison that dripped from the tips of its fangs turned to smoke in contact with the air and caused the water to boil when it fell on it. Kratos parried the attack with one sword while he struck with the other. The head and the spine of the snake's neck jumped into the air. Its body thrashed wildly as it perished, but the head continued to try to bite him as its dark eyes glared at him. Kratos held the head between his two swords and waited for the ferocity to dissipate and give way to death. Just as it happened in the end. He looked just in time to see new waves approaching him through the water, more snakes beneath the murky surface, and in too many numbers to be able to avoid them. One bit him and sank its fangs into his greaves, trying to pierce the heavy bronze with them. Kratos didn't wait to see if he could do it. With the pommel of a sword he crushed the fragile skull. The fangs and jaw were caught in the greave. More snakes, too many to count, swam toward him and made the water bubble. Kratos repeatedly lashed out at the surface with his swords, turning them into a sort of deadly shield. He walked resolutely forward until he returned to the point where the tunnels met. The waters stirred, dyed red with the blood of the snakes. Then they calmed down. You could only hear the dripping of moisture falling from the walls. Kratos looked into the water and saw something moving, but it wasn't snakes. He raised his foot and brought it down hard with the intention of crushing whatever creature was down there. He felt his foot slip into the outline of a boot carved into stone. Curious, he moved his other sandal forward and found the corresponding gap. He stood there for a moment, with both feet stuck in the footprints under the water. When he made to continue walking, he felt a slight vibration that ran through his body until it reached the chains embedded in his wrists. Kratos saw the phosphorescent moss writhing on the walls. He lifted one foot from the hole and the moss stopped flowing. When he dropped his foot again, the moss lit up again. He approached curiously to touch the moss. It twisted sinuously, as if it were a snake, and moved away from his fingers. A growl rose from deep in his throat. There was no sound except the slow drip of humidity. He held out his fingers and forced the moss to avoid his index finger. The moss surrounded him, forming a circle around the place where he had placed his finger, as if it wanted to show him a way out of that tunnel. He leaned lightly and applied some pressure. Nothing happened. Both hands. You may need to use both hands. He returned to where the footprints were, put his feet into them and slid his finger along the right wall until the moss again marked a specific point. He pressed it. Nothing. He approached the other wall and repeated the movement, the moss making another flourish of greenish light. When he moved his finger closer, he found a gap higher up before the moss pointed out a specific spot. Kratos pressed with his fingers, probing each of the marked points. "Zeus Almighty," he whispered. His eyes widened as a portion of the ceiling began to descend. Instead of retreating to defend himself, he stayed where he was until the trapdoor opened completely and revealed a staircase leading to the upper level. He removed his fingers from the walls and hurried to reach the ladder just as it began to retract. Holding onto the ladder, he let the trapdoor carry him to a room whose floor rose a hand's breadth above a slow-flowing stream. A channel of stones solidly fitted together formed the course of the stream. He shook his body to dry. He wiped his armor with the edge of his sword and freed himself from the snake that had sunk its fangs into his greaves. Kratos hadn't even realized the snake's tenacity. Those poisonous aquatic snakes were nothing compared to the prey that had to be collected. Not only did he have to face a monster that would turn him into stone if he looked it in the face, he also had to find a particular Gorgon. Queen Medusa ruled over her sisters, but unless she wore a crown or a scepter, Kratos had no idea how he could distinguish her from the others. The sound of sandals against stone announced that someone was approaching through the tunnel in front of him. He raised his swords, but a primitive instinct warned him against fighting. Ingenuity could also lead to victory, as he had discovered when he found the secret path to the lair. Kratos backed away and entered a shallow stone alcove with several empty shelves. The walls of the chamber were dotted with other similar niches, but in the others the shelves were full of objects. It seemed reasonable to think that whoever approached would take the products they had come to look for and not bother to look in a niche that they knew was empty. And if he wasn't right, he always had the swords. In that place they could find a sudden and bloody death. Two men entered. One, a hunchback, led the other, an old man who wore a dirty cloth around his eyes. They were selecting objects from the different shelves. The hunchback carried the blind man with twice as many boxes as he carried. "My back is going to break," the hunchback complained. "I'll give you another one, okay? I can barely stand, but it's okay, put it up. We can't risk making two trips. If we take too long, Queen Medusa will punish us both." Again, agreed. "Once a day is more than I can bear. My back is broken from so many beatings." He placed several more voluminous boxes on top of his companion's already bulky load while he was left with only a couple of light boxes. Kratos watched them walk away, the blind man, weighed down by his burden, and the hunchback with a lighter step. It was evident that in that maze there were two kinds of people, those who did all the work and those who could see. Since Kratos belonged to the second group, he felt no temptation to want to change that pattern. He followed them in absolute silence, disturbed only by the sound of his sandals coming into contact with the water. As he moved forward, he left some marks in the luminescent moss. If he managed to accomplish his mission, he would have to find a way to get out of there. It was possible that Aphrodite would take him directly back to Athens, but she might have to return to the place where she had abandoned him. It never hurts to prepare against possible betrayal, especially from the gods. "Bring me the food, you dirty vermin." The voice came from the next chamber, where a lamp kept the darkness at bay. Kratos stopped and hid in the darkness before the threshold. Although the voice had sounded harsh and almost inaudible, like pebbles clattering in a brass jug, it seemed to him that the words had been spoken by a woman. If he was right, one careless look could condemn him to becoming a stone statue for an eternity in which he would be the object of the Gorgon's mockery. Jer, the one who could see, answered, "Right away, my lady Medusa. I brought you supplies." "You?" the blind man protested. "I have been the one who." "Kala, shut your dirty human mouths and get to work. My sisters and I are getting hungrier." And more furious. His voice took on a dangerous tone. "I feel that the time is approaching to impose some punishment." "Oh," the blind man whimpered through his teeth. "Oh, Zeus, may I die right here if you lay a hand on me again." "Don't complain, you lucky bastard, at least you can't see," Jer whispered through his teeth. "Those mirrors, those damn mirrors in his rooms. No matter where she looks, she can always see herself." The clanking of pots and people stoking a fire made Kratos glance over. With a glance faster than the blink of an eye, he could see the entire kitchen. The blind man transferred some type of meat and sauce to a cauldron as large as a bathtub while Jer tended to the fire below. It seemed that the queen of the Gorgons liked suckling lambs. But no, they weren't lambs, Kratos realized as his stomach tightened. They were little children. Kratos clenched his fists with the desire to attack that terrible image. Children. Children like his own daughter, his beloved daughter who. He took a step forward, but forced himself to hide until the right time came. The cannibal feast increased his rage and the need to destroy the Gorgons. Aphrodite had ordered him to take Medusa's head, and he would gladly do so, whether a goddess ordered it or not. The blind man filled a loaf of stale bread with the steaming baby stew and shuffled toward a dark doorway on the other side of the small kitchen. Jer watched him go, then sneaked over to the huge cauldron, grabbed a ladle, filled it, and held it to his nose so he could appreciate the aroma. "That old blind man is learning to cook," Jer murmured, raising the ladle to his lips. But before he could taste the baby stew, a huge hand grabbed him by the back of his neck and lifted him into the air. He dropped the ladle into the tureen and tried to scream, but the hand around his neck closed around him to silence him. He tried to resist, kicking and clawing at his hand, but the ash-colored skin seemed even stronger than bronze. A moment later he came face to face with the ghost of Sparta. His eyes widened, and a muffled moan managed to make its way through Kratos' fingers. "Medusa," the Spartan murmured. "Where?" "Just point. Point and I'll let you go." Between frantic hand movements, Jer managed to point out that the chamber of the Gorgon Queen was located in the dark corridor, behind the first door on the right. Kratos nodded his head. With the swift movement of his hand, Kratos crushed Jer's larynx, thus preventing him from screaming or begging for his life. He then lifted the child cook over the cauldron where the meat was being cooked and, as he had promised, he released him. Kratos was aware that the most dangerous moment would be when he entered the chamber of the Gorgon Queen. If he mistook the real Medusa for one of his reflections and looked her square inches the face, he wouldn't get a second chance. Fortune favors the brave, he thought, and launched himself into the attack. With a panther's leap he crossed the threshold and arrived at the door of Medusa's chamber just an instant after the blind man. He was barely holding the plate with one hand while opening the door with the other. Hearing Kratos behind him, he turned slightly. "Jer," was all he had time to say before Kratos snatched the plate from him and sent it flying with a kick into the center of the chamber. Kratos was careful not to look at anything but the ceiling. Jur hadn't lied, but he hadn't told the whole truth. The walls were covered in mirrors, and more mirrors covered the ceiling from side to side. In them he saw the blind man colliding with the frightful monster. Before either of them had time to react, the snakes that made up Medusa's hair untangled themselves, launched themselves all at once against the blind man and bit him just as the water snake had done with Kratos' greave. As the blind man twitched, the snakes writhed and drew him up to Medusa's face. Kratos felt sick to his stomach at what he saw in the mirror and decided to scrap the rest of his plan. With 3 quick steps, Kratos reached the dying man and the Gorgon, who was screaming angrily as she tried to push the unfortunate slave away from her face. When she finally managed to get him off of her, she raised her head and, on the wall full of mirrors, she saw her own death behind her. Kratos jumped, kicked it with both feet, and knocked the monster face first into the ground. At that same instant, the blades of chaos flashed in a converging slash that pierced the monster's collarbones and upper ribs. Kratos dropped the swords and put both hands into the wound. He crossed the Gorgon's tissues with his fingers until he reached the spine, and with the strong pull he tore the head from the rest of the body. The head snakes bit his arm, but they were almost harmless. They had spent a good part of their venom on the blind man. He stood still for a moment and looked at the reflection of the dead look in the mirror, the terrifying eyes, the powerful fangs, the hair of living snakes. Kratos arched his back as he felt a sudden movement drag him upwards once more. From the dark underground chambers, illuminated only by moss, something transported him to a place illuminated by a dazzling white light. "You have done very well, my Spartan." "I'm not your Spartan," he thought, but he just said, "My lady Aphrodite." She used her free hand to protect herself from the light, and little by little she began to make out the diaphanous silks that invitingly covered the goddess's body. He raised the severed head, holding it for the snakes, which were already dead. "My lady Aphrodite, do you want anything more from me?" "Yes, one more thing, now that I have made sure that you have carried out the mission that I have entrusted to you." "Here," he said, offering Medusa's severed head, careful to keep the face facing away. "Grab her from the snakes. That is, be careful not to look her in the eyes. Now throw it over your shoulders, just like you do with those impressive swords you carry on your back." Kratos obeyed and felt the snake slip from his hands. What happened? Where has he gone? It will be there when you need it. Reach your hand back and she will come to you, looking straight ahead and ready to use her powers. And how does it work? It's magical. There is one more thing you should know. Medusa's power diminishes in the face of the dead. Doesn't it turn them into stone? Yes, it converts them, but they don't last that way for long. Kratos stared at Aphrodite, waiting for her to finish explaining herself. For 10 seconds if you look them directly in the eyes. Whatever you do, don't lose it. Aphrodite opened her hands and looked at him squarely. "Athene wants it when you're done. You want to put it to some use. Something to do with the shield. Or was it the cape? It doesn't matter. You have destroyed the queen of the Gorgons and now her power belongs to you." In a second, Aphrodite grew to the height of a mountain, as if her hair could touch the moon, and her voice rang like a great bronze bell. "Paralyze and destroy them all with the gaze of Medusa," said the goddess, in a thunderous voice. "Go and may the gods be with you, Kratos. Keep going, in the name of Olympus." Before he could take a breath to respond, he found himself back in Athens. Ares still towered over the Acropolis, launching balls of Greek fire the size of a house. When Kratos managed to get his bearings, he realized that he was once again in the quiet neighborhood from which the goddess had torn him away. The temple of Athena and her oracle were still on the other side of the Acropolis. He lowered his head and ran. He ran like the lion hunting the lamb, swift as a hawk, tireless as the wind. I had to run. I had wasted a lot of time, and for what? To gain power he didn't need. A power that had nothing to do with finding the priestess of the oracle, nor with defeating the god of war. If Aphrodite had really wanted to help him, she would have left him at the door of Athena's temple with the fortune teller in front. The gods and their games. I was already fed up. When he killed Ares, he would forget about everyone and their absurd demands. And his nightmares would leave his dreams and every waking moment. Forever. Smoke descended in circles from the top of the Acropolis. A greasy black curtain fell over the Parthenon and threatened to suffocate Krotos. The armor he had taken from the legionaries protected him from the deadly heat of the flames and protected his back, which Ares had burned with his fire, but it could not help him breathe. Panting, he had to turn around for air and find a clearer path to the summit. None of the fireballs of the god of war had yet hit that neighborhood, but the area had not gone unnoticed by the legions of Ares. Wandering monsters of all stripes patrolled its streets. The cavalry was made up of a mix of minotaurs and centaurs, the cyclops made up the heavy infantry, the skeleton archers, the legionnaires, the harpies, the ghosts and... what was that? Those creatures looked like horrendous women, but instead of legs they had a large serpentine tail. Their heads were crowned by restless snakes and they shot green rays of energy from their eyes. Apparently, the death of their queen had caused the rest of the Gorgons to join the fight. But all of Greece knew that there were only 3 Gorgons, Steno, Euryale and, of course, Medusa, who recently died. However, Krotos saw a dozen of those disgusting creatures, and he had no doubt that at that very moment there would be many more in other parts of the city. Finishing them would fuel his anger and distract him for a while from the nightmares that constantly tormented him, but it would be a waste of time that neither he nor the Oracle Priestess could afford. What awaited him would definitively solve the problem of his visions. He had to find a clear route that would lead to Athena's oracle. Krotos went into an alley and climbed onto a barrel that was used to collect rainwater. From the barrel he was able to reach a balcony, and from there climb a couple more floors until he reached the roof. Athens was in flames. Except for the area he was in, the entire city was engulfed in flames. Through the smoke some fragments of the walls could be seen. The flashes of light that jumped out with the clash of weapons allowed him to see that the soldiers were still losing their lives in that useless attempt to not give in to a wall that was no longer capable of defending the city. Everyone had to die somewhere, if doing so while defending their useless wall made them believe that they were dying for a noble cause. Who was he to deny the vain heroic gesture? Many men had fallen to their swords for much less. Krotos slowly advanced along the roof, looking for a path to follow up the hill. He moved cautiously, avoiding attracting the attention of the harpies that were flying through the smoke. The old man who guarded the city gates had told him that the oracle chamber was on the east side of the Parthenon. On the slope of the Acropolis I could distinguish light brown marks that could well have been footprints, but the clouds of smoke completely hid much of the avenues. As he approached the edge of the roof to get a better perspective, an arrow whizzed past his ear. Krotos dropped to the ground as more arrows rained down around him. He dared a quick glance over the eaves and spotted a handful of undead archers stationed on a balcony. Krotos saw a man who ventured out into the street and was hit in the belly by one of the arrows. When it detonated, the explosion scattered its guts in front of the door of his own house. The archers only stopped shooting when they had no targets in sight. Krotos ducked as a new ball of Greek fire exploded less than 2,000 cubits away, about where he assumed the path leading to the top of the Acropolis began to ascend. In his head, an idea began to take shape. The most logical thing was that Athena's followers, seeing that the god of war was attacking their city, fled in the direction of the Parthenon. Ares had sowed the entire city with fire except for that neighborhood, where the road leading up to the Acropolis began, the place where the faithful would flock like flies to dung. Furthermore, the god had his monsters patrolling the streets, preventing any possible escape. Krotos understood it all. The god of war was deliberately bringing the most pious and devout among Athena's followers to that small area, making it seem like the safest part of the city, apart from the only possible route to his temple. Goddess. Instead of fleeing to the countryside, where catching and killing them would be, even for Ares's minions, a difficult task, They themselves concentrated there, carried away by the illusory sense of security that neighborhood offered. They were concentrating where they could most easily take them out. All at the same time. No fuss. Without too many complications. No chases through the forests or having to drag anyone out of caves in the mountains. The citizens of Athens were behaving like cattle going straight to the slaughterhouse. It was brutal, and Kratos knew it worked very well. He had done similar things. He put his hands on his temples to prevent his head from exploding while an image burned inside him harder than the sun itself. No. It couldn't be. The corpses, the ones he had murdered in Athena's temple. He was guilty. He had killed. Gasping, Kratos managed to push away the horrible vision. Every time it took hold of him more strongly, but letting himself be carried away by horror was not going to make it easier for him to access the Parthenon. Momentarily he was able to overcome his own nightmares, but monsters were gathering in the streets to block his way. And he was aware that those archers had not forgotten that he was up there. He had to get going. And he had to do it quickly. On the other hand, he saw no reason to descend to ground level. With 3 long strides, he gained enough momentum to leap to the roof across the street. The skeletons were so surprised that they did not shoot any arrows. As he quickened his pace, he heard the command order of a Minotaur, and knew that the troops in the street had discovered him. His next jump, apart from causing a shower of scattered arrows that did not come close to their target, allowed him to see the legionaries mounted on the rump of the centaurs following him in parallel through the streets. With the new jump he reached another roof and the harpies began to descend on him. He avoided them, roof after roof, without slowing down, using his swords as grapnels to bridge the gaps that were too large and turning them over his head to keep the harpies at bay. He continued running faster and faster across the rooftops, gaining speed on the harpies but not on the screams and orders that could be heard at Gr.